All right. Well, it's 12 o'clock, so we will get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. Before we do get started, I do want to let you know that this program is being recorded and it will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum YouTube channel after this presentation. My name is Melissa Keevy. I am the executive director at the museum. I want to welcome you to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual series, History in Focus. History in Focus explores relevant historic topics in Upper Manhattan and the surrounding areas. We would like to thank the Honorable Carmen de la Rosa, New York City Council District 10, for her support of this program. During this lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function and we will answer those questions at the end. Today we are joined by Dr. Andrew Rasmussen, a professor of psychology at Fordham University and head of the Culture, Migration, and Community Research Group. Dr. Rasmussen's research focuses primarily on the psychological needs and assessment of displaced populations. Today, Dr. Rasmussen will present Tradition, Family, and Conflict among New York City's West African communities. West African immigrants comprise some of the fastest growing communities in New York City. Dr. Rasmussen will present findings from 3 studies from 2 decades of research with various West African immigrant groups. Findings point to challenges often reported by new immigrants related to child rearing and resolving spousal conflict. Parents' concerns about children acting American are exacerbated by fear of child protective services, leaving parents feeling at a loss of how they can stay true to their culture's strict values concerning child rearing. Children who acculturate faster than their parents often appreciate close monitoring and even strict discipline by parents, but also feel that they are somewhat limited by it. Spousal conflict also appears to be related to more conservative cultural norms, but is also related to the necessity of the 2-income households in the city. Findings from all 3 studies are integrated to build a model of social problem solving in West African communities, one that includes family members, neighbors, community leaders, and then also state actors. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Rasmussen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm going to just share my screen now, and we will get started here. Welcome. I want to thank the Dyckman Family Farmhouse for inviting me to give this talk. As I have to remember not to give my whole presentation in the abstract, but that's what I'm going to be talking about, what the director just talked about. So I'm at Fordham University, and indeed I do lead the Culture, Migration, and Community Group. We are interested, and myself and graduate students who have come to work with me over the years at Fordham are really interested in a lot of these types of topics, things that related to the acculturation of new immigrants, discrimination that they receive from outside of their communities, but sometimes even within their communities, culture and psychology in general. And more recently, we're working on issues related to immigration court and how psychology interfaces with immigration court. But today, I'm going to be talking about what the title says there, Tradition, Family, and Conflict among really within New York City's West African communities. I'm going to be presenting some general information about West African immigrants in New York City, talk about some of the problems that have been raised or have been identified and sort of the way, the different versions of those problems that have been identified in these communities, and then talk about some strengths and problem solving within these communities. Before I do that, I always feel it's necessary in talks like this to sort of give you a little bit of background from where I'm coming from. Obviously, I'm not coming from any West African immigrant community, although I've spent a lot of time with West Africans in New York. Nobody would mistake me for anybody from West Africa. So I'll give you a sense of my trajectory to how I came to working with um, these particular neighbors in New York. So it really starts about 20 years ago in the hallways of Bellevue Hospital, where, as a newly minted psychologist, I was hired to work at a program that dealt with the needs of war survivors and torture survivors in New York City. Now, you might think, wow, that's sort of a niche area, but it turns out that quite a few people who are seeking health care and mental health care at Bellevue Hospital are also have histories of going through war. And there's a clinic set up at Bellevue. It's still there, but it was set up in the 90s, actually, primarily in response to waves of people from the former Yugoslavia, Bosnians primarily, but also some Croatians, who were in New York and having problems related to their experiences during the Yugoslavian conflict in the 1990s. And so, as you can imagine, when a psychologist hears war and torture, we're thinking trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. Everybody sort of knows about PTSD now. That was a little bit less so in 2005, even less so in 1995 when the clinic got going. Um, when psychologists think about these sorts of big, terrible events, we think about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. And those were certainly the case within the communities that we served. And during my time there, before coming to Fordham, most of the clients were from some part of Africa, about half from West and Central Africa. Um, and in interacting with clients as a clinician and as somebody who I was hired to do some research with and program evaluation, um, I kept getting the sense that, well, okay, we're mental health professionals, so we're going to think about mental health problems. But um, post-traumatic stress disorder, psychological problems, depression, anxiety that people are experiencing, that's can't be the whole story here. There's got to be other things going on there. And so that led me to um, reach out beyond Bellevue's halls to say, okay, what are some of the background issues, and what are the ways that some of the stuff that affected people in the wars that they've been through, how does it affect their social relations with one another? Because as a psychologist, you know that certainly, we like to think of ourselves as therapists, and that's all nice, but most people don't interact with psychologists in therapeutic spaces, and certainly not from in immigrant communities, the rates of participation in therapy are lower. So what are the ways people are dealing with these things? And so that led me to work with a bunch of community groups. And I focused on West Africans just as sort of like, okay, let's start with the largest population we're dealing with, and then we'll move on to the rest. And I've, stayed with West Africans since then. Um, but these ideas got, I partnered with a colleague at Bellevue who is also at City College, Adeyinka Akinsuluri-Smith. She's a professor at City College, been there a while now, to address some of these issues with something we called the West African Families Project. We also involved Tracy, she was Tracy Chu at the time, Brooklyn College. She's now Tracy Wong at Brooklyn College. She's a professor there. And then also we had a research assistant, Eva. This was all, uh, 15, 16 years ago. Since moving to Fordham, I've kept up doing this sort of work. And in addition to that, those academic connections, we worked with community groups. The community group I've worked the most with is called Union Futa. Union Futa is really a international organization based around Fulani people. Fulani people are a particular ethnic group that is really widespread across West Africa. I'm not an expert in West African history, but it essentially they are the diaspora of a a major kingdom, a Fulani kingdom that was in that covered large areas of West Africa years ago. And they're very active. They do a lot of ethnically based stuff, so celebrations, weddings, funerals, all those sorts of things. But they also have a committee that's interested in healthcare of their community and all that. They're not technically a service community, and so we wanted to partner with those service organizations as well. African Services Committee in Harlem does a lot of healthcare stuff. Sauti Yetu, which is started in the Bronx, but also in Uptown Manhattan, and I think they're out in Brooklyn as well as Queens. They are a center focusing on primarily Muslim women who have been in intimate partner violence situations and are trying to get out of them. And then African Refuge Center, which is a well-established community-based, real grassroots center started by Liberians in Staten Island, where there is a Liberian community that's been there for 30, almost 40 years. So these are our community partners. And these are the people we sort of reached out to, said, hey, we're interested in doing some work to identify what are the problems within families of the people that we're seeing at Bellevue. And it's only grown from there. Let's back up and give you a little background of African immigrants in New York City in general. Currently, they are among the fastest growing populations in New York City. They're the only growing Black populations in New York City. In other words, African Americans have been sort of holding steady in New York City and sort of slightly declining, moving elsewhere. Afro-Caribbean or their children of Afro-Caribbean immigrants have been moving out of the city for a long time. African immigrants from Africa, from the continent, are actually growing. And so there are more and more Black people in New York City who are from Africa rather than other African diaspora populations. They're very diverse in terms of religion, different branches of Islam, different denominations and intensity of Christianity. And they're also very different in terms of reasons for migration. There are lots and lots of people who come here to work in healthcare and in technology. And some people come just to be here and try and make money and send money home. Of course, most people are doing that to some degree, but get, work in hair salons or in home health aid type jobs. But on average, Africans in the US and Africans in New York City are more highly educated than just about everybody. Other immigrant groups, more highly educated than their sort of SES peers as well. And so there are lots of nurses, there are lots of doctors. Some of those doctors are driving cabs, but they are very well educated. So there's wide variation there. Of course, African immigrants today are really only the latest wave of Black migration to the city. Of course, there's a period of slavery in New York City, which is sort of the largest and longest period of Black migration. Ended in 1827, supposedly. Slave ships were still allowed through, so I would imagine some people made their way off at that point, maybe. But then in terms of immigration, like we like to think of immigration, slavery is, of course, very forced migration of a different type than we think of when we think of forced migration today. But when we think of waves of Black migration to the city, very often people think of the Great Migration. The Black population of New York City was actually declining following the Civil War, and really it's because of the draft riots that occurred during the Civil War in New York City that largely many of the participants targeted African Americans who were living here and free African Americans. And so a lot of them moved out after the draft riots for obvious reasons. But the Great Migration brought another wave of primarily, national African Americans, people who were from the South moving up to the North and Midwest. That lasted well into the 60s, some say in the 70s. And then post 65, there was a large, and 65 into the 70s and 80s peaked were large waves of migration from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from Barbados. And West Africans and Africans in general, African immigrants in general, don't direct from Africa, don't really start coming here until they really get going in the 1990s, but then it speeds up very quickly. And as I said earlier, they're really still among the fastest growing populations in New York City. Even with this the recent uh, wave of migrants, right? I don't know why we don't call them immigrants anymore, but now we call them migrants. Wave of migrants in the past 5 years. The sort of quintessential ones, the ones you hear about on the news are Venezuelan, are Salvadoran, but there were lots there, and there's still, and well, there aren't anymore because that's been shut down, but there were lots and lots of people from West Africa who got flights to places like Colombia, to Ecuador, and then came up overland and crossed the southern border of the US and were bussed up here from Texas. So there are lots of new African immigrants in New York City right now. We know that at last count, and this is a little bit out of date, there are about well over 2 million African immigrants living in the US. And of those, a good third plus are from West Africa. It's the largest single region, if you consider it a cohesive region, to send African immigrants to the US. The others are in East Africa. We don't have a whole lot of East African immigrants in New York City. They certainly are here, but in terms of large numbers and large communities, it's really mostly West Africans and some Central Africans as well. When we're talking about West Africa, what are the countries we're talking about? Well, the big sending countries in terms of New York City are Senegal and Gambia, Guinea, and then Sierra Leone and Liberia also. Of course, we also have a lot of Nigerians. There are lots of Nigerians in the U.S., all over the U.S. It shouldn't be surprising that Nigeria has the largest population of any country in Africa, actually, in the whole continent. Something like 1 in 4 Africans are from Nigeria. So, but in terms of New York City, there are lots of people, mainly from the coast, and sort of the Atlantic coast on the extreme end: Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia. Some people from Burkina Faso and Mali as well. All right. Let's get to the actual stuff that my colleagues and I have really looked at over the past couple decades, 15 years of doing this work, maybe. The topics of concern for West African families really boil down to child discipline and spousal conflict. Now, maybe this is one of those findings that academics sometimes, come up with, and you say, aren't those obvious topics for families? Yeah, those are the things that families worry about. You could put money in here, but money is already in spousal conflict. So, yeah, these are obvious topics. If you know about families, if you have a family, if you're part of a family, you probably you touch on these as areas of conflict. There is an added complication, of course, when you are here and you're not so confident in your immigration status. I don't mean just people who are undocumented, but I mean people who maybe have a documentation that can be easily taken away. Certainly in today's climate, and with the administration, targeting immigrant communities, that is a big concern. But when there is this sort of immigration enforcement aspect to that's always in the background, family conflict becomes a bit more of an issue. In addition, there's state intervention that is not immigration enforcement, but that may appear to be the same thing or a link to immigration enforcement. So enforcement. So, for instance, the involvement of Administration and Child Services, ACS, Child Protective Services, um, in in families often makes a lot of immigrant families, and this is from every immigrant community, nervous that there's going to be a connection to immigration enforcement. They're going to get deported. Um, these days, and you'll see, I'll provide some data to support this. These days, in West African communities, there's this term 911, and that's essentially calling the police, right? Um, that is associated with kids who don't want to get spanked, and they call the cops, right? It's a somewhat of a trope, maybe a myth, but it's there. This is not unique to any to particularly to West African immigrant communities. It's not particularly unique to today. I mean, the idea of the welfare coming for your kids was something that immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe talked about 125 years ago, right? The welfare being this new progressive interest in poor families. And then with regard to intimate partner violence or spousal conflict, police often get involved. They get called either by one of the spouses or by the neighbors, or maybe they just witness it. Um, and there's that added problem, if you will, or threat of deportation that makes these concerns that much more concerning, if you will. I'm an academic, so I got to have a model of how we think about this. And psychologists, oddly, haven't really thought about immigration and family conflict very much. Um, I say that oddly because, that you'd think in the U.S. that immigration would be front and center. Um, However, a few people have, and a few very smart people have. One of the leading lights in our field is a guy named Carlos Slisky. I think he's originally from Argentina or Uruguay. And he developed this model of migration and family conflict, where over on the y-axis there is family well-being, where you have less conflict above, up, and more conflict below. And on the x-axis, you have your timeline. And essentially, he identified four phases of family well-being across migration period. There's preparation, which really happens pre-migration. Migration, which certainly is the actual getting on the plane or getting on the bus or making your way across from Colombia through the Darien Gap of Panama up through Central America and Mexico, right? All that involves the migration narrative, the journey. But he didn't conceive of that once you get here being the end, because you have to get settled, you have to get resettled, you might have to get settled again, right? You have to find a job and all that sort of stuff. But he talked about that as being a time of relative high expectations, high hopes for what the future may bring. But of course, at some point it stops, and then there's a decompensation. Um, and then there's a sort of a leveling out of that decompensation in transgenerational phenomena. What happens with the kids? What happens for the expectations for what happens to the actual immigrants in their older age, that sort of thing. Um, when we looked at Slutsky's model, we sort of broke it up into three sections with the idea that if we're going to test a model, we want to know, can they be broken up into pre-migration, migration, and post-migration? And if we look at these three sections, these three ideas, these three time periods, do we find that preparation is happy, migration is okay, people are struggling, but they're getting by, and then post-migration things go bad? I'll say by way of preview, it's not all this way, but uh, but it can be this way at times. So, okay, I'm going to be providing data from two studies, actually. I realized the abstract said three. I've cut them down to focus them. The folks you're going to be hearing from, the people who are going to be providing quotes here, are both voluntary and forced migrants. Although, of course, I came through this from the Bellevue clinical forced migrant lens, actually, we ended up finding a lot of the issues are very similar in voluntary migrants and forced migrants. It's sort of somewhat arbitrary who applies for asylum and who doesn't. Um, because everybody's had some sort of exposure, but also because there are strengths in both forced and voluntary migrants that often overlap. So just today, I've selected two studies of our, I don't know, 8, 9 studies we've done over the past 15 years um, on focus groups concerning challenges to family life, and then talking about the migration narratives themselves. I'll give you the methods that we did for the focus groups and the methods we did for the migration narratives, and then we'll get into the results here. So for the focus groups, we worked with community-based organizations, CBOs, mosques and churches. We did recruiting there. We did recruiting from healthcare providers, folks like African Services Community, which I mentioned earlier, and then also legal services, because there were we worked with Bronx defenders, actually, not too far from just across the river there from not too far across the river from the Dyckman house there. And we asked, okay, we recruited people from this, say, would you like to be part of the study? We're going to get you in a focus group. We had a bunch of focus groups. We had focus groups with adults and focus groups with kids. And then we had large focus groups and small focus groups. And asked them to describe a challenge or conflict you had in the past in your family in the last 2 weeks. Everybody went around, described them, then talked about, all right, where do you go for help in those situations? All sorts of stories come out. The second study is this migration narratives, and we identified 12 families from similar sources, and had a couples interview. We had a few families that just had one adult, as it was a single mother, a single father, and there was actually a couple where one of them was not in the country at the time. And we said, tell me the story of how your family came to the U.S. from your home country. And then later followed up with each individual spouse to get, their story of how you're doing now, and then also to check that we got the narrative details right. And all of this and the previous one, sort of trying to map it onto this pre-migration, migration, post-migration thing. All again, just to remind you, it comes down to how does migration affect or cause conflict? What came out were all these topics. Reestablishing parental authority in at the end of the migration phase and the post-migration phase, particularly in families which is typical, adults come first, or an adult comes first, and then the rest, kids come later, sometimes often with the spouse. And then in couples, migration and other women. I'm saying that because we didn't have any stories of migration and other men, but migration and other women, including in some of the Muslim families, other wives, because in West Africa and Islam, as it's practiced in many parts of the Islamic world, men are allowed to take up to 4 wives. Many don't, but you're allowed to. And then also men not being able to provide for the family here like they did back home. And then as regards state intervention, we had this 911 issue. I mentioned it before. I'll talk about it again. And then family conflict and how immigration authorities may or may not be connected to spousal conflict, really. Okay, I'm going to be presenting a series of quotes. It's a snippet of a quote, actually, that represent these issues, and then we can go from there. So here is a discussion of discipline, and this was a major issue, and this is a major issue. It's a major issue in many families, obviously, but also in many immigrant families. So I don't say this is that much different from discipline and culture that you might find in a family from, I don't know, Honduras or Dominican Republic. But this was a guy from Gambia who was very concerned about kids becoming too Americanized, not respecting their parents in the way they should, and not deferring to them completely as he felt they did back home. So we want to adapt our kids to our cultures back home, and if you want to do that, you must punish, you must discipline the child. Discipline was and education was often thought in the ways that if any of you know French or Spanish, you know éduquer in Spanish, in French, and éducation in Spanish isn't just about going to school and learning reading, writing, arithmetic. It's also learning to behave. Somebody, you say someone is educado, they know how to behave right? And this is the sort of idea behind disciplining and punishing in a lot of families. It wasn't always corporal punishment. In fact, it usually wasn't corporal punishment, what they were talking about, but sometimes it was corporal punishment because, of course, that's common in a lot of parts of the world. Discipline was also associated with protection, as it is in most families. Here's a 33-year-old mother from Sierra Leone who had a few teenagers in her family. If you see me outside, you see my kid. You don't see them by themselves because I am scared. She lived in the Bronx. She had actually been mugged, and she also had a particularly difficult trauma narrative from back in Sierra Leone during the war, where she was attacked and held captive. So she was very did some very close monitoring of her kids. When we talked to the kid about this, at least her oldest kid, the 16-year-old boy, he actually was appreciative of that, which, I remember being a 16-year-old kid in New York City. I would not have been appreciative of that, right? But he was actually appreciative. He said, she's there and she can like rush to the problem. If we fall something, she's right there. And so there's often I think a narrative, at least in psychology, that within immigrant families, the kids are way ahead of the parents, and they really think the parents are being silly. Sometimes that's true, not as much as not as much as we think it is, particularly not in these communities. Kids appreciate it, even if they understand that their parents are being a little bit over the top, and it may feel somewhat stifling. How about in terms of other women? Well, here's a husband from Guinea who had been in the U.S. for a long time. He was not sure how to stay. He was not exactly, he had some things happen to him, but he hadn't claimed asylum. And so he got a call from a woman who was coming to the U.S. who he had known prior to getting married. He had known romantically. He said, back in Africa, I was with this lady. When she told me she's coming here, I said, it's better for me to get married with this lady than to stay without a wife, because his wife was, because I don't have any hope that my wife is going to join me in America until I get this good advice from a doctor for the asylum application. So he had a conversation with this doctor, and the doctor said, well, you can apply for asylum and then your wife can come. He's like, what? Oh, all right. And so there was certainly this other woman in their relationship, but it had to do as much with the perception that he was going to be separated from his wife forever, and so he might as well, get married with somebody else, somebody who had already had some relationship to. A woman from Guinea had a different perspective, as you can imagine. Said, we are Muslim people. They're going to get married, 2, 4. And then she's talking about her husband here. He told me that he wanted to marry other one lady live in Connecticut. My husband called her, and I said, listen, you're not going to call her here. Then I took the phone, and we had a fight a little bit about it. Gender roles were a major problem for spousal conflict, a major source of distress. And it has to do with traditional ideas around both women being at home taking care of the kids. There's a high gender divergence in a lot of West African cultures where women take care of the kids, men go out and get the resources, and then come home and support that way. The man was doing everything before, and when they don't have it, So I'm going to feel stress when I say, I want this, he can't give it to me, or I want this for the kids, he don't have it, right? So there are expectations that are not met. This is then magnified almost because in New York City, you can't live on one parent's salary when the access, unless you are, in finance. And nobody in this community is, well, I have to say, I've found a couple of people in finance, but most people in West African communities are not in really high paying positions. And so there's not the financial ability to fulfill the roles that are set back in the home communities. So couples that can't make that adjustment, many couples can, but couples that can't find themselves in this situation. In terms of gender roles, it's like blaming me. This is a husband from Sierra Leone, blaming her, like we are the ones who caused the problem of ourselves, right? They start getting into an argument about what the problem is. Uh, and she says, there are times when she said she want to go back. If she's going to die there, let her go die there. When I talk to her, oh my God, it's like when you put a gas in the fire. So it's not just um, gender roles, it's also about the experiences people had back in the home country, which led them to leave, and that they are still very activated about. So if we map out these problems, what we found when we mapped these out on a pre-migration, migration, and post-migration, and these are just three examples. This isn't a generalization or a law or a proof of anything really. What we found is that there are somewhat predictable times when there are going to be spousal conflict, and it happens more often in the end of migration, early post-migration period. So when people are just getting settled or after spouses come during reunification. Reunification is and that's what those R's are. Reunification is always a tricky time. So it's when one person has come over, a parent, and well, it's always a parent, and either a spouse has joined them, and then they're happy to see each other, but then there's always some friction, right? You've been apart for a few years, or when there has been parent-child conflict, it's also come usually at reunification. So that last line you can see there. We think this is important to know because it helps at least those of us who have been working with families for a long time. It helps us prepare other families who are coming, saying, okay, reunification, you may need some supports, you may need to anticipate this and the other way. Okay. In terms of Slutsky's migration and family conflict, it really is in this at the end of migration, early post-migration period that decompensation happens, and it has to do with reunifying after being apart. And there are problems of other women, there are problems of trying to establish your authority over a child that you haven't seen for a while, and the kid doing that as well. I want to do this relatively quickly, but I think one of the interesting things about our work, one of the most interesting pieces, has been discovering how people address these issues and then how that fits with state and community responses to family conflict. First of all, many people talked about 911. It's this idea that, when I tell him don't do this, don't do that, he wanted to tell me, I'll call 911. I said, why you call this? He said, my teacher told me if you beat me here, I have to call 911, right? So a response to any even threat of corporal punishment is call 911. This is the gentleman from Gambia who we heard from before. If the child holds now that if the parent touches him, he can call and report, they will call 911. The child will not be afraid of the parents anymore, right? And that's a problem for discipline. This was reflected in discussion by the kids. Is an 18-year-old girl out in Staten Island, a Liberian family. If someone called the police on their parents, do you think that parent's going to keep that child? No, they're going back. What does she mean by going back? She means by going back to Liberia or a home country in West Africa. And there are multiple reports of and instances that I'm aware of where people send their kids back to their home country to learn the culture. It's also associated with learning the language. It's also associated with, spending time with the relatives there. Um, this is not an uncommon thing among several immigrant groups, actually. It's not at all particular to African immigrants, but this idea, it's called child fostering, where you are taking a child and saying, you know what, for whatever reasons, I can't uh, deal with my kid right now. Maybe I'm working too much. I have to work because I have to pay for things. I have to send money home to support my kid. Or they need to learn home culture, where they send them back to live with relatives. It turns out not to have negative impacts on kids, and we need to remember that as a society that often thinks about things like that as being a problem. But of course, extended families are families, and particularly in many cultures in West Africa, extended families are sources of a lot of support. Um, In terms of intimate partner violence, spousal conflict, what are the ways that people solve these things? In the African community, we have elders. We have people who can come talk to the guy. Yeah, we could say, first step, go to them. Tell them what's happening. So there are community level interventions that can happen that it means that individuals who immigrate here need to be connected to those things, but they do exist in New York. They can go to an ethnically based organization. They can go to a mosque. Um, Sometimes they don't work. So here's an example of this was in the same conversation with that gentleman who said that thing about the elders. This woman from Sierra Leone said, "No, what they say is you, the wife, you wrong. You don't have to go to the police. You have to come to us, and we'll tell you to deal with it." Um, this was echoed in other interviews. Here is an example of a woman who's 45 from Guinea, had been in a particularly terrible situation. And she went to family members and she said, his family and my own family members in the Bronx, like uncle, relative from my father's place, they called the whole Africa. And all of a sudden, everybody knew about her problems. And so everybody's talking, which of course makes things worse. She didn't get the advice she needed. Um, Added on to this is that layer of immigration concern. I have no money. He has his papers. I went to the family courts, said that I was and he said that I was the one who left him, leaving him with kids. Um, a similar situation here, right? In America, when someone is here illegal, when you report to the police, they will pick you and send you back, tie your hands. And I was like, oh, I don't want to go back. So what does conflict resolution look like in this community? From these narrative and qualitative studies, we tried to pick out pieces to sort of examine a larger structures of problem solving. Well, the individual there is that egg there in the middle. It says individual. In terms of sources for where did you go for help, the first thing people mentioned was religious help, God, also religious help like imams and pastors. For problems with kids, they went to spouses. For problems with parents, they went with problems between spouses, they went to parents. Other family members, all in there. I encircle those with a thick line because that's a barrier that most people don't want to cross. That woman who said all of a sudden the whole Africa knows about my problems. That's a fairly shameful situation. However, the next step, if those things don't work, it's implied in a lot of these quotes and other quotes that I wasn't able to present, that if that doesn't work, if you can't resolve within your family, there's other community support that you should go to. The problems, according to the participants in a lot of our studies, uh, occur when you don't respect those sort of step-by-step things and you jump over them and you go to outside resources. Because outside resources, they really don't know about community support, right? All our outside resources that we have in this country, police, ACS officials, they don't deal with communities. They deal with families and they jump over this community level. And that's seen as a threat to a lot of people within the community, that suddenly these structures that have been there, that are there in West Africa, and are perceived to be working. Whether they are working or not is the question, but they're perceived to be working, and they're cultural structures. They're culturally valued. When those things are then subverted by legal authorities going right to families, they're seen as a real threat, and it's sometimes the result of that is some victim blaming, where the person making the complaint is blamed for not respecting the culture, not being from the culture enough. And then, of course, there's this background of immigration enforcement, which just heightens the anxiety and the angst about all these things that much more. Okay, so I want to sort of stop there because we have 15 minutes left. I think these are questions that we sort of proposed from this work. Sort of, what's the purpose and process of child discipline? How can it be brought up? A role for extended families, community organizations, and then in terms of immigration enforcement, whether it's really a concern if they go to the police or not. I think those things have changed more recently to where it's out on the real concern. But I want to get to everybody's questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function to share those. I'm sorry, I have a few questions, so I'm just trying to bring them up really quickly.
You want me to stop the presentation, or should we keep it up?
Yeah, you can stop sharing, and
right. We can go back to it if we want.
Yeah, sure. So the first question we have is, did you have any preconceived notions or predictions that were later disproven as you continued this research project and collaborating with community groups?
Yeah, well, one of them was sort of sort of my own field of psychology is when we, as I said before, when you hear about war survivors and trauma, and when we think about, popular notions of West Africa and the conflict that was widespread in lots of different areas of that region in the 1990s and 2000s, I thought there was going to be a lot more issues that were really related to trauma, and that was a real eye opener for me. I said, no, wait a minute, there are plenty of other things that happen too. Sure, that stuff exists, but it's not the end all be all. And it's not, for most people, it's not their everyday existence concerns. It comes into play sometimes, but where it comes into play is what we were interested in. And then we became interested in all the other pieces. Other than that, I was, to be honest with you, I was a little surprised by some of the stuff that surprised and really kind of impressed, to be honest with you, with some of the stuff that the kids were saying about being, understanding their parents. That we didn't hear very much from parents who understood their kids. Parents' concern was, oh, their kids are going crazy, right? They're being really, look at the way they're dressing, look at this, that, the baggy pants. Everyone was wearing baggy pants at the time, and they're all into this rap stuff, and but the kids were sort of like, look, my parents are concerned about this. They have reason over this. They see this on the street. They see some crazy stuff on TV. I get it. I want to be respectful. A number of Muslim kids were almost always like, I try and participate at the mosque. I try and do this. So that was for me, and what I taught junior high and high school before I went to grad school. So I had I had an idea of what New York, and I was a New York City kid myself. So I had an idea of what New York City kids could get into. And I was surprised and impressed by these kids that they were so understanding of their parents' views.
That's great. It's always good to hear when kids are actually, well adjusted, especially having gone through a lot. Yeah. So another question we have is, why is there less parent-child conflict at migration and during migration?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's because the kids and parents aren't really together. Pre-migration, yes, but pre-migration is, they're still home. They have all the cultural support for the way that parents and kids interact. I heard a lot of parents talk about how kids back home in Africa, they know you can look at them one way and they'll obey immediately, that sort of thing. And so they have that whole sort of ecology of how you're supposed to interact with older people. Um, During migration, the reason it's not there is because very few uh, parents migrate with their kids. It just doesn't happen very much. Occasionally, but really very few. So it's really in that at the end of migration or that initial post-migration phase.
Great. Okay. So I have one final question. How do the previously mentioned community groups or community elders address these conflicts without state intervention? What have been the more effective solutions than calling 911?
Mm-hmm. Um, well, it's a combination of reasoning and shaming. Really, um, there's when it happens, and the sort of the sad bit about it is that it doesn't happen a whole lot. Those structures are there, and they're there in theory. Sometimes they're not really there, but people say they're there. But when they are there, and there are a couple of examples of community organizations that have really gotten, interested in getting a panel of, let's say, older men who go and talk to young men who are accused of, I don't know, hitting their wife or something like that. And they'll say, look, you shouldn't do this. This is not how you treat a wife. And sometimes they'll have an imam come in and say, look, this is not the way you treat your wife, or wife, this is not the way you treat your husband. And so advice in a group, and then sometimes if this doesn't happen, we're going to get involved and we'll have to refer to the police.
Great, thank you. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate you sharing your work with us. I hope that everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer free public programming at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. I would like to remind you that this was the first in a series of lectures for our History in Focus series. Join us here on May 29th at 12 p.m. on Zoom for Plentiful Country, the Great Potato Famine, and the Making of Irish New York with Dr. Tyler Anbinder. And be sure to register through the link in the chat and follow us on social media for updates. And I thank you and hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, Dr. Rasmussen.
Thank you very much.
All right.